The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the federal courthouse as Lieutenant Commander Ashley Johnson adjusted her Navy dress uniform one last time. The gold buttons gleamed against the dark blue fabric, and her chest displayed an impressive array of ribbons and medals earned through years of dangerous missions overseas. At 34, Ashley had accomplished what few women ever could. She was one of the Navy's elite SEALs, having completed some of the military's toughest training and most classified operations. Today felt different, though. Instead of preparing for a mission in some distant country, she was walking into a courtroom to fight for someone much closer to home, her younger brother David. The charges against him seemed ridiculous to anyone who truly knew his character, but Ashley understood how the system could sometimes work against people who looked like them. As she pushed through the heavy courthouse doors, Ashley noticed the crowd gathered outside. Some held signs supporting her brother, while others seemed less friendly. The local news had been covering the case for weeks, turning what should have been a simple court proceeding into something much bigger. She kept her head high and her shoulders square, just like her military training had taught her. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere felt heavy. Ashley had been in war zones that felt less tense than this marble-floored building. She watched as various people moved through the metal detectors, noting how some of the court security officers seemed to pay extra attention to certain visitors. Her trained eye picked up on the subtle signs of hostility, the longer stares, the whispered conversations, the way some officers positioned themselves. The courthouse lobby buzzed with quiet conversations and the shuffling of papers. Lawyers in expensive suits walked past families dressed in their best clothes, all hoping for justice in their own cases. Ashley found herself thinking about all the courtrooms around the world where people sought fairness, and she wondered if this one would deliver it today. As she made her way toward the correct courtroom, Ashley caught snippets of conversation from people who recognized her uniform. Some seemed impressed by her obvious military rank and decorations, while others appeared less welcoming. She had faced enemy fire in 3 different countries, but somehow this felt more personal, more threatening. The security checkpoint ahead required her to remove her uniform jacket and place it in a bin for screening. As she did, more of her medals became visible, telling the story of a distinguished career in service to her country. A young boy waiting in line with his mother pointed at her ribbons and asked loudly what they were for. Ashley smiled and briefly explained that they represented missions where she had helped keep America safe. But not everyone appreciated her service record. From across the lobby, she noticed one particular security officer watching her with obvious disdain. His name tag read Officer Reynolds, and something about his posture and expression reminded her of the kind of person who saw her uniform not as a symbol of service, but as something that didn't belong on someone who looked like her. The elevator ride to the 4th floor felt longer than usual. Ashley shared the small space with other people heading to various court proceedings, some nervous defendants, worried family members, and stern-faced attorneys. She found herself thinking about David and how this whole situation had started with what should have been a routine traffic stop 6 months ago. When the elevator doors opened, Ashley stepped into a hallway filled with people waiting for their cases to be called. Some sat quietly on benches while others paced nervously. She spotted her family gathered near the windows, her parents, her aunt, and several family friends who had come to show support. Their faces lit up when they saw her, providing the first genuine smile she had encountered since entering the building. Her mother rushed over to hug her, careful not to wrinkle the crisp uniform. "I'm so proud of you for being here," she whispered. Ashley's father, a retired factory worker who had served in Vietnam, straightened his tie and stood a little taller when he saw his daughter in her dress blues. These were the moments that reminded Ashley why she served, not for the recognition or the medals, but for the people she loved and the values she believed in. As they walked toward the courtroom together, Ashley noticed more security officers taking positions in the hallway. This level of attention seemed excessive for what should have been a straightforward hearing. But she understood that high-profile cases sometimes attracted extra scrutiny. What concerned her more was the way some of these officers looked at her family, as if they were potential troublemakers rather than citizens seeking justice. The courtroom doors stood open, revealing rows of wooden benches and the imposing judge's bench at the front. Ashley had been in many intimidating places during her military career, but there was something about a courtroom that felt different. Here, decisions were made not with weapons or strategy, but with words and evidence and the hope that truth would prevail. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and prepared to enter what might be the most important battle of her life. Not fought on some distant battlefield, but right here in the heart of the American justice system. Officer Rick Reynolds had been working courthouse security for 15 years, and in that time, he had developed strong opinions about who belonged in his building and who didn't. Standing 6 feet tall with graying hair and a permanent scowl, he watched the morning crowd with the kind of suspicious eye that came from years of seeing the world in black and white. Literally. From his position near the metal detectors, Reynolds observed the Navy officer who had just passed through security. Something about her confident walk and the way people looked at her uniform with respect made his jaw clench. He had served briefly in the military himself, though his discharge hadn't been honorable, and seeing someone like her wearing those decorations felt wrong to him. "Look at that," he muttered to his partner. Officer Tommy Brooks nodding toward Ashley as she reunited with her family, acting like she owns the place. Brooks, a younger officer who usually just tried to get through his shifts without trouble, glanced over uncomfortably. He had learned to mostly ignore Reynolds' comments, but lately they had been getting more frequent and more bold. "She's just here for the hearing like everyone else, Rick." "Yeah, right," Reynolds snorted. "Probably thinks that fancy uniform makes her special. I've seen her type before. They come in here expecting special treatment just because they wear the flag on their sleeve." The truth was, Reynolds had a file full of complaints against him. Complaints that somehow never seemed to stick or result in serious consequences. Citizens had reported his aggressive behavior, his inappropriate comments, and his tendency to escalate situations unnecessarily. But each time, he managed to explain away the incidents or blame them on misunderstandings. His supervisor had talked to him multiple times about his attitude, but Reynolds had friends in the department and knew how to work the system. He understood which complaints to take seriously and which ones he could brush off. After all, who was going to believe troublemakers over a veteran officer with 15 years of service? As the morning progressed, more people filled the courthouse for various hearings. Reynolds positioned himself strategically where he could keep an eye on Ashley's family and the growing crowd of supporters who had come for David's case. He noted their faces, their clothes, their mannerisms, everything that confirmed his biased assumptions about who they were and why they were there. "This is going to be trouble," he told Brooks, adjusting his equipment belt, which included handcuffs, pepper spray, and a taser. "Look at all these people they've brought in. They're planning something, I can feel it." Brooks looked around at the mostly quiet crowd of family members and community supporters. "They seem pretty calm to me. Just people waiting for court to start." "That's what they want you to think," Reynolds replied, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who had convinced himself of his own theories. "But I've been doing this job long enough to know when trouble's brewing. And that woman in the uniform, she's probably their ringleader." The irony was lost on Reynolds that Ashley had spent her career actually fighting for the country he claimed to protect. While he had been bullying citizens in a courthouse, she had been risking her life on dangerous missions overseas. But his worldview didn't allow room for such complexities. Judge Patricia Wong was known for running an efficient, fair courtroom. As she prepared for the morning's docket, she reviewed the case files and noted the unusual amount of public interest in David's hearing. She had been a judge for 12 years and had seen how certain cases could become lightning rods for larger social issues. From her chambers, she could see the crowd gathering in the hallway through her window. Most appeared to be family and community members. Exactly the kind of people she expected to see supporting a defendant with a good reputation. She made a mental note to ensure extra security was present, not because she expected trouble, but because high-profile cases sometimes attracted unwanted attention. Meanwhile, Reynolds continued his surveillance of Ashley and her family, his radio crackling with routine communications from other parts of the building. Each time he spoke into the device, his tone carried an edge that suggested he was dealing with a potential threat, rather than ordinary citizens exercising their right to attend a public hearing. "Control. This is Reynolds at the 4th floor entrance," he reported. "We've got a large gathering for the Johnson hearing. Recommend we keep extra eyes on the situation." The control room operator, who had worked with Reynolds for years, responded routinely. "Copy that, Reynolds. Just keep it professional and let us know if you need backup." But Reynolds was already beyond professional. In his mind, he was preparing for a confrontation that existed only in his biased imagination. He saw threats where others saw families, problems where others saw citizens, and challenges to his authority where others saw people simply seeking justice. His radio chatter became more frequent as the morning went on. Every time someone from Ashley's family moved to use the restroom, every time a supporter checked their phone, every time someone whispered to a friend, Reynolds reported it as suspicious activity. The control room staff began to wonder if he was overreacting, but they trusted his experience on the job. What they didn't know was that Reynolds had been escalating his behavior for months. Other court officers had noticed his increasingly hostile attitude toward certain families, his tendency to interpret normal behavior as threatening, and his habit of making inappropriate comments about people's appearance or backgrounds. But in the culture of law enforcement, speaking out against a colleague was often seen as betrayal. Officer Brooks had witnessed Reynolds' behavior firsthand and had grown increasingly uncomfortable with his partner's attitudes. There had been several incidents where Brooks felt Reynolds had been unnecessarily aggressive with courthouse visitors, but he had never filed a formal complaint. Like many officers, he had been taught that loyalty meant protecting your partner, even when you disagreed with their actions. Now, watching Reynolds focus his hostility on a decorated military officer and her family, Brooks was beginning to realize that his silence might have enabled something dangerous. But he still didn't understand just how far Reynolds was willing to go to assert his authority over people he saw as threats to his worldview. As the time for the hearing approached, tension filled the air, not from Ashley's family and supporters, who remained respectfully quiet, but from Reynolds himself. His aggressive energy was like a storm cloud building pressure, waiting for the right moment to explode. Ashley, focused on preparing mentally for her testimony, remained unaware of the hostile attention she was receiving. Her military training had taught her to be aware of her surroundings, but in a courthouse surrounded by her family, she felt as safe as she would anywhere. It was a feeling that would soon be shattered by one man's prejudice and abuse of power. The courtroom fell silent as Ashley rose from her seat in the gallery and walked toward the witness stand. Her military bearing was evident in every step. Straight posture, measured pace, eyes forward. The morning light streaming through the tall windows caught the gold braiding on her uniform, and several people in the courtroom seemed to sit up straighter just watching her approach. Judge Wong nodded respectfully as Ashley placed her hand on the Bible and took the oath to tell the truth. There was something about military witnesses that always brought a certain gravity to court proceedings, and Ashley's obvious rank and decorations suggested she was someone who had seen serious service. "Please state your name and occupation for the record," requested David's attorney, a middle-aged public defender named Mr. Martinez who had been impressed by Ashley's credentials when they met earlier. "Lieutenant Commander Ashley Johnson, United States Navy SEALs," Ashley replied clearly, her voice carrying easily through the courtroom's sound system. A few murmurs rippled through the gallery. Navy SEALs were legendary, and many people had never seen one in person, let alone a woman who had achieved such an elite status. From his position near the courtroom doors, Officer Reynolds felt his anger rising. The respectful attention Ashley was receiving from everyone in the room only reinforced his belief that she was getting special treatment she didn't deserve. He shifted his weight and adjusted his equipment belt, his eyes never leaving her. Mr. Martinez began with basic questions about Ashley's military service, allowing her to establish her credibility. She spoke clearly about her training, her deployments, and the nature of her work, though she kept classified details appropriately vague. With each answer, it became more obvious that this was someone who had dedicated her life to serving her country at the highest level. "And how long have you known the defendant?" Martinez asked. "David is my younger brother," Ashley replied, a slight softening in her voice. "I've known him his entire life, 28 years. What followed was testimony that painted a picture of David completely different from what the prosecution had suggested. Ashley described growing up in a working-class family, where military service and community involvement were valued above everything else. She talked about David's decision to join the Army after high school, following in her footsteps of military service. "My brother served 2 tours in Afghanistan," Ashley explained. "He came home and immediately got involved in working with young people in our neighborhood. He started a mentoring program for kids who were struggling in school, using his military training to teach discipline and goal setting. Judge Wong listened intently, occasionally taking notes. She had reviewed David's service record and background information, and everything Ashley was saying aligned with the documented facts. This wasn't a character witness trying to cover for a family member's bad behavior. This was someone providing honest testimony about a person's true character. Ashley continued, describing specific examples of David's community work. She told the court about the summer program he ran for at-risk youth, teaching them basic life skills and helping them stay out of trouble. She mentioned the families he had helped during the pandemic, using his own savings to buy groceries for neighbors who had lost their jobs. Has your brother ever been in trouble with the law before this incident? Martinez asked. Never, Ashley replied firmly. Not even a parking ticket. David understands that military service comes with responsibility, and that responsibility doesn't end when you take off the uniform. From the prosecution table, the district attorney seemed uncomfortable. The case against David had seemed straightforward when it was just a traffic stop that escalated. But having a decorated Navy SEAL testify to his character was creating complications they hadn't anticipated. Officer Reynolds, meanwhile, was growing increasingly agitated. He whispered into his radio, "We need to keep an eye on this situation. The witness is stirring up the crowd." But looking around the courtroom, anyone could see that the crowd was simply listening respectfully to testimony. Exactly what they were supposed to be doing. Ashley's most powerful testimony came when she described the phone call she had received about David's arrest. She had been on a training exercise when the news reached her, and she immediately knew something was wrong because the charges didn't match the brother she knew. "I flew home as soon as I could get leave," she said. "When I saw David, he told me exactly what happened during that traffic stop. He was polite, he followed all instructions, he kept his hands visible at all times. Everything we learned in the military about de-escalating tense situations. But somehow, a routine traffic stop turned into resisting arrest charges." Her voice remained steady, but those who knew Ashley could hear the controlled emotion underneath. This wasn't just about legal testimony. This was about a sister defending her brother's honor and reputation. "In your professional opinion," Martinez asked carefully, "based on your military training and experience, do you believe your brother would resist a lawful police order?" "Absolutely not," Ashley replied without hesitation. David's military training would never allow him to escalate a situation with law enforcement. He knows that compliance and respect for authority are not just smart tactics, they can save your life. As her testimony continued, Ashley provided specific examples of David's character under pressure. She described how he had helped her through difficult times during her SEAL training, how he had supported their parents during their father's illness, and how he had always been the family member others turned to in crisis situations. The courtroom remained completely quiet throughout her testimony, with even the court reporter seeming to lean forward to catch every word. Judge Wong asked several clarifying questions, clearly impressed by Ashley's direct, honest answers and her obvious credibility as a witness. "Lieutenant Commander Johnson," the judge said during one exchange, "you've served in combat zones where split-second decisions can mean life or death. In your experience, how important is it for someone to remain calm under pressure?" "Your Honor, staying calm under pressure isn't just important. It's essential for survival," Ashley responded. "In my line of work, panic gets people killed." David learned the same lessons in the Army. "We were both taught that no matter how stressful a situation becomes, you follow procedures, you stay respectful, and you never escalate unless your life depends on it." Her answer seemed to resonate with everyone in the courtroom, including some of the law enforcement officers present, who understood exactly what she meant. Training and discipline were supposed to prevent exactly the kind of situation that had led to David's arrest. But in the back of the courtroom, Officer Reynolds was reaching his breaking point. Every word of respect Ashley earned, every nod of approval from the judge, every supportive glance from the gallery felt like a personal insult to his authority. His hand unconsciously moved toward his taser, and his jaw clenched tighter with each passing minute. The powder keg was almost ready to explode. As Ashley concluded her testimony and began to step down from the witness stand, something beautiful happened in the courtroom. Her words about David's character and service had moved many people in the gallery, and as she walked back toward her family, A spontaneous wave of quiet applause began. It started with David's former Army unit members who had come to support him. These veterans, some still in uniform and others in their best civilian clothes, began clapping softly. The sound spread to the community members who knew David from his youth mentoring program, then to neighbors who had witnessed his kindness over the years. Judge Wong looked up from her notes as the gentle applause continued. In her 12 years on the bench, she had rarely seen such a genuine, respectful show of support for a witness. This wasn't disruptive or inappropriate. It was simply people acknowledging testimony that had clearly come from the heart. "Thank you, Lieutenant Commander Johnson," Judge Wong said with a slight smile. "You may return to your seat. And I'll remind everyone that we need to maintain courtroom decorum, though I appreciate the respectful nature of your response to the witness." Ashley nodded professionally to the judge and began walking back to join her family. The applause faded naturally as people settled back into their seats, but the atmosphere in the courtroom had definitely shifted. Where there had been tension and uncertainty before, there was now a sense that truth was being heard. David, sitting at the defendant's table, wiped tears from his eyes as he watched his sister walk past. Her testimony had captured exactly who he was as a person, and seeing the courtroom's positive response gave him hope that justice might actually prevail. His attorney, Mr. Martinez, squeezed his shoulder reassuringly, but Officer Reynolds saw the situation completely differently. From his position near the back of the courtroom, the applause looked like defiance of authority. The respectful silence that followed seemed like calm before a storm, and Ashley's confident walk back to her family appeared to him like a victory lap that challenged his control over the situation. His radio crackled to life as he pressed the button. "Control, this is Reynolds. We've got a situation developing in courtroom 4B. The witness just incited applause from the crowd. Looks like they're organizing something." The voice from control sounded routine. "Copy, Reynolds. Do you need backup?" "Stand by," Reynolds replied, his eyes locked on Ashley as she moved through the rows of seats. His hand rested on his taser and his breathing had become noticeably heavier. In his mind, he was no longer dealing with a family attending a court hearing. He was facing down what he saw as a threat to law and order. Ashley reached the row where her family was sitting and paused to embrace her mother, who had tears of pride in her eyes. The gesture was completely natural, a daughter seeking comfort from her parent after what had clearly been an emotional experience. Around them, family members and supporters offered quiet words of thanks and encouragement. "You did so well, honey," her mother whispered. "David is lucky to have you as his sister." Ashley's father, the Vietnam veteran, stood up and saluted his daughter briefly, a private moment of respect between two people who had served their country. It lasted only seconds, but it was captured by several cell phones in the gallery as family members documented this important day. But Reynolds interpreted every gesture as suspicious activity. The embrace looked like a huddle. The supportive words sounded like planning. The cell phones appeared to be coordinating some kind of action. His years of complaints and disciplinary actions had never taught him to see peaceful citizens as anything other than potential threats. "They're definitely planning something," he radioed again, his voice getting tighter. "The witness is now coordinating with the crowd. We need to take action before this gets out of hand." Officer Brooks, his partner, looked around the courtroom confused. "Rick, they're just families talking quietly. This is normal for after testimony." "You don't see what I see," Reynolds snapped back. "That woman thinks she's in charge here just because she's wearing a uniform. Someone needs to remind her that this is my courthouse, not her military base." Judge Wong had moved on to the next item on her docket, but she noticed the increased radio chatter from the back of her courtroom. Court security officers were supposed to be virtually invisible unless needed, but Reynolds seemed to be creating unnecessary disturbance with his communications. Ashley, unaware of the hostile attention she was receiving, sat down next to her aunt and pulled out her phone to quickly text her commanding officer about how the testimony had gone. It was an innocent message, just letting her military supervisor know that she had represented the Navy appropriately in a civilian court setting, but Reynolds saw her using her phone and became convinced she was coordinating with people outside the courthouse. His paranoia reached a breaking point as he watched her type the message. In his twisted view of the situation, Ashley wasn't just a sister supporting her brother. She was a military operative organizing some kind of action against his authority. The irony was devastating. Ashley had spent years fighting actual enemies overseas to protect the very freedoms that were now being threatened by a bigoted security officer in an American courthouse. She had risked her life to defend the Constitution, only to find her own rights under attack in the place where that Constitution was supposed to be most sacred. As she put her phone away and turned to listen to the next part of the hearing, Reynolds made his decision. He began moving through the courtroom, his hand now firmly gripping his taser. His partner tried to follow, confused about what was happening but sensing that Reynolds was about to do something dangerous. "Rick, what are you doing?" Brooks whispered urgently. "She's just sitting there listening to the judge." "She's stirring up trouble," Reynolds hissed back. "Look at how everyone's watching her, waiting for her signal. I've seen this before. They're planning to disrupt the court when the judge makes a ruling they don't like." Brooks looked around the courtroom and saw nothing but families quietly attending a public hearing. Some people were indeed glancing at Ashley occasionally, but it was the kind of respectful attention given to someone who had just delivered powerful testimony, not the coordinated behavior of people planning trouble. "I don't see any problem here," Brooks said, trying one last time to reason with his partner. "Maybe we should just—" "I'm not asking for your opinion," Reynolds cut him off. "I'm the senior officer here, and I'm handling this situation before it gets out of control." The spark that would ignite this powder keg was about to become a flame that would change everyone's life forever. What happened next would be replayed on news channels around the world, analyzed in law enforcement training sessions, and remembered as one of the most shocking examples of police brutality ever captured on video in a courtroom setting. Officer Reynolds approached Ashley's row with aggressive, determined steps. She was sitting quietly next to her aunt, listening to Judge Wong address a procedural matter with the attorneys, when she sensed someone standing in the aisle beside her. Looking up, she saw Reynolds looming over her, his face flushed with anger and his hand gripping a yellow taser. "Ma'am, I need you to step out into the aisle," Reynolds commanded in a voice loud enough to disrupt the entire courtroom. Judge Wong stopped speaking mid-sentence and looked toward the disturbance. Ashley, drawing on her military training to de-escalate tense situations, responded calmly and respectfully. "Is there a problem, officer?" "I'm just sitting here listening to the proceedings." "Don't argue with me," Reynolds snapped, though Ashley had done nothing but ask a reasonable question. "You're disrupting this courtroom and inciting the crowd. I said move to the aisle, now." Judge Wong banged her gavel once. "Officer Reynolds, what is the nature of this disruption? This witness appears to be sitting quietly." But Reynolds was beyond listening to anyone, including the judge. His prejudice and paranoia had completely taken over his judgment. "She's been organizing this crowd, Your Honor, using her phone, coordinating with outside agitators. This is a security threat." Ashley stood up slowly, keeping her hands visible and her movements deliberate, exactly as her SEAL training had taught her when dealing with volatile situations. "Officer, I'm happy to cooperate. I was just texting my commanding officer about my testimony. There's no problem here." Her calm, professional response should have de-escalated the situation. Any reasonable law enforcement officer would have recognized that Ashley was cooperating fully and posed no threat whatsoever. She was surrounded by her family, in a courtroom full of witnesses and clearly trying to avoid any confrontation. But Reynolds saw her composure as defiance. Her military bearing looked like arrogance to him. Her attempt to explain herself sounded like backtalk. In his twisted worldview, everything Ashley did to cooperate became evidence that she thought she was better than his authority. "Don't tell me what you were doing," he shouted, raising his taser. "I saw you stirring up these people. You think that uniform makes you special? You think you can come into my courthouse and take over?" The courtroom erupted in gasps and shocked voices as people realized what was about to happen. Ashley's mother reached for her daughter's arm, while her father started to stand up. David jumped up from the defendant's table, and his attorney grabbed him to prevent him from interfering. "Officer Reynolds, stand down immediately," Judge Wong commanded, her voice carrying the full authority of her position. "There is absolutely no justification for weapon deployment in this situation." But it was too late. Reynolds, consumed by years of hatred and resentment, pulled the trigger on his taser. The electrical prong shot across the short distance and struck Ashley in the chest and shoulder. 50,000 volts of electricity coursed through the body of a decorated Navy SEAL who had survived combat missions but was now being attacked by the very system she had sworn to protect. Ashley's body went rigid as the Electrical current overwhelmed her nervous system. She collapsed to the floor between the rows of courtroom benches, her military uniform now wrinkled and her dignity under assault from a man who had no business wearing a badge. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Ashley's mother screamed and tried to reach her daughter, while her father shouted at Reynolds to stop. Other family members and supporters jumped to their feet, some pulling out phones to record what was happening, others just staring in shock at the unbelievable scene unfolding before them. David broke free from his attorney's grip and started toward his sister, but other court officers, horrified by what their colleague had done, held him back to prevent the situation from getting worse. "That's my sister," he yelled. "She's a Navy SEAL. What's wrong with you?" Judge Wong was banging her gavel furiously and shouting orders that were barely audible over the chaos. "Officer Reynolds, you are in contempt of court." Security restrained that officer immediately. "Someone call paramedics." But Reynolds wasn't finished. As Ashley lay on the floor, her body still twitching from the electrical shock, he stood over her with a look of satisfaction on his face. "Maybe next time you'll show some respect for authority," he said loud enough for several people to hear. What Reynolds didn't realize was that his assault was being recorded by multiple sources. The court's own security cameras were capturing every angle. Several family members had their phones out, live streaming or recording the incident. Even some news reporters who had been covering the hearing were documenting what would soon become one of the most viral videos of police brutality ever recorded. More importantly, there were federal law enforcement agents in the courtroom. 2 FBI agents who had been observing the proceedings as part of an unrelated investigation witnessed the entire assault. They had seen Reynolds approach an innocent, cooperative citizen and deploy a weapon without any legal justification whatsoever. Officer Brooks, Reynolds' partner, stood frozen in horror at what he had just witnessed. He had known Reynolds had problems, but he never imagined his colleague would attack an unarmed woman in a courtroom full of witnesses. "Rick, what have you done?" he whispered. But Reynolds seemed deaf to everything around him except his own twisted sense of victory. As Ashley lay on the courtroom floor, surrounded by her terrified family and watched by dozens of witnesses, she maintained the quiet dignity that had defined her military career. Even in the face of such an unprovoked attack, she didn't lash out or lose her composure. She simply tried to breathe through the pain and process what had just happened to her, in what was supposed to be a temple of American justice. Her training kicked in even through the electrical shock. She assessed her condition: painful muscle contractions, difficulty breathing, burning sensation where the prongs had hit, but no immediate life-threatening injuries. Around her, she could hear her family's voices, Judge Wong's commands, and the general chaos that erupted when injustice happened in plain sight. The shockwaves from this moment would ripple far beyond the walls of courtroom 4B, changing lives and careers and forcing a reckoning with the abuse of power that had been allowed to fester for far too long. The aftermath of Officer Reynolds' assault on Ashley unfolded with the speed and precision of a military operation. But this time it was justice itself mobilizing to respond to an outrageous abuse of power. Judge Wong's voice cut through the chaos like a sword. "Officer Reynolds, you are under immediate arrest for assault, contempt of court, and violation of civil rights under color of authority. Bailiffs, take him into custody this instant." Reynolds stood frozen, apparently shocked that his actions were having immediate consequences. For 15 years he had gotten away with complaints and inappropriate behavior, always managing to escape serious punishment. But assaulting a decorated military officer in front of a federal judge and multiple witnesses was a line too far to cross. The 2 FBI agents who had witnessed the entire incident sprang into action. Special Agent Maria Santos and Special Agent Kevin Park had been in the courtroom for an unrelated federal case, but what they had just seen was clearly a federal crime. They moved quickly toward Reynolds, their badges visible. "Officer Reynolds," Agent Santos announced clearly, "you're under federal arrest for deprivation of rights under color of law. You have the right to remain silent." Reynolds finally seemed to understand that his world was collapsing around him. "Wait, you can't do this." "I was maintaining order." She was disrupting the court. "By sitting quietly in her seat?" Agent Park responded incredulously. "We watched the entire incident, officer. You assaulted a citizen who was fully cooperating and posed no threat whatsoever." Meanwhile, paramedics rushed into the courtroom to attend to Ashley, She was conscious but clearly in pain from the electrical shock. Her military training had taught her how to handle physical trauma, but being tased was a uniquely disorienting experience that affected the nervous system in unpredictable ways. "Ma'am, I'm Paramedic Johnson," the lead EMT said as he knelt beside her. "Can you tell me how you're feeling? Any numbness, burning sensation, or difficulty breathing?" Ashley's voice was steady despite her obvious discomfort. "Some muscle cramping and a burning sensation where the prongs hit. My vision is a little blurry, but I think I'm okay." Even while being treated for injuries from an unprovoked attack, she maintained her professional composure. Her mother knelt beside her, holding her hand and fighting back tears. "Honey, just focus on getting better. Don't worry about anything else right now." But Ashley was worried about something else: the impact this incident might have on David's case and on her own military career. Even as the victim of a clear assault, she was thinking about how her involvement might affect others. Judge Wong temporarily recessed the court to allow the situation to be properly handled. But she made sure to address the courtroom before anyone left. "Let me be absolutely clear to everyone present," she announced. "What just occurred was a criminal assault by a court officer against a citizen who was peacefully exercising her right to attend a public hearing. This behavior is not representative of law enforcement, and it will not be tolerated in my courtroom or anywhere in this justice system." The judge's words were being live-streamed by several people in the courtroom, and within minutes, clips of both the assault and her response were spreading across social media platforms. The hashtag #YerderNavySealAssaulted began trending almost immediately. Officer Brooks, Reynolds' partner, stood in stunned silence as he watched his colleague being handcuffed. He had worked with Reynolds for 3 years and had always suspected the man had problems with racial bias, but he never imagined it would lead to something like this. "I tried to tell him to calm down," he told Agent Santos. "He wouldn't listen to anyone." As Reynolds was led away in handcuffs, his police union representative was already on the phone trying to do damage control. But this wasn't a case where spin or legal maneuvering could help. The assault had been witnessed by federal agents, recorded by multiple cameras and live-streamed to thousands of viewers. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Colonel Patricia Martinez, Ashley's commanding officer, received an emergency call about the incident while she was in a meeting at Norfolk Naval Base. Within minutes, she was on a plane to personally ensure that one of her officers received proper support and medical attention. The Navy took care of its own, especially when they were victims of injustice. The courthouse administration went into crisis mode. Sheriff William Thompson, who oversaw court security, arrived within 20 minutes to personally apologize to Ashley and her family. "Lieutenant Commander Johnson," he said formally, "please know that Officer Reynolds' actions do not represent the values of our department or this courthouse. We will cooperate fully with all investigations and ensure this never happens again." David's attorney, Mr. Martinez, found himself in the surreal position of having his client's case transformed overnight. What had started as a routine hearing about disputed charges had become a national symbol of justice system dysfunction. "Your Honor," he addressed Judge Wong, "in light of these events, we believe it's clear that my client's original arrest may have been part of a pattern of discriminatory enforcement." The prosecution, meanwhile, was quietly discussing dropping all charges against David. Having their case associated with Officer Reynolds' obvious prejudice was a public relations nightmare they wanted to end as quickly as possible. The paramedics were preparing to transport Ashley to the hospital for further evaluation when she insisted on speaking to the court one more time. Despite the pain and disorientation from the taser attack, she felt compelled to address what had just happened. "Your Honor," she said, supported by the paramedics and surrounded by her family, "I want everyone to know that I don't blame all law enforcement for one officer's actions. I've worked alongside many brave and honorable police officers overseas, and I know they're as disgusted by this behavior as anyone else." Her words carried a weight that seemed to calm some of the chaos in the courtroom. Here was someone who had just been the victim of police brutality, yet she chose to speak about healing rather than hatred. "Justice isn't about revenge," Ashley continued, her voice growing stronger. "It's about making sure this never happens to anyone else. Officer Reynolds will face the consequences of his actions, but the real victory will be if this incident leads to changes that protect other people from going through what I just experienced." The courtroom fell silent as people absorbed her words. Even some of the law enforcement officers present seemed moved by her grace under such terrible circumstances. Ashley had turned what could have been a moment of pure hatred into a call for justice and reform. As the paramedics helped her toward the exit, Ashley looked back at Reynolds, who was now in handcuffs and facing the collapse of everything he had built, through 15 years of prejudice and abuse. She felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only sadness that it had taken such an extreme incident to finally hold him accountable. The wheels of justice, so often slow to turn, were already spinning at full speed. Within hours of the courthouse incident, Officer Rick Reynolds found himself facing the complete collapse of everything he had built over 15 years in law enforcement. But more importantly, the system that had protected him for so long was finally being forced to confront its own failures. The viral video of Ashley being tased had been viewed over 10 million times by evening. News organizations around the world were running the story with headlines like "Decorated," Navy SEAL attacked in courthouse, and Judge watches officer assault veteran. The footage was so clear, and the injustice so obvious that even Reynolds' strongest supporters couldn't find ways to defend his actions. Sheriff Thompson called an emergency press conference at 6 p.m., flanked by FBI representatives and county officials. The sheriff, a 30-year law enforcement veteran, looked genuinely shaken as he addressed the cameras. "Today, one of our officers committed an assault that goes against everything we stand for in law enforcement," he began. Lieutenant Commander Johnson was peacefully attending a court hearing when she was attacked without provocation. "This behavior is criminal, and it will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." What made the sheriff's statement particularly powerful was his decision to release Reynolds' entire disciplinary file to the public. 15 years of complaints, reprimands, and suspicious incidents were suddenly in the open, showing a clear pattern of discriminatory behavior that had been overlooked for far too long. The police union, which typically defended officers regardless of circumstances, issued an unprecedented statement distancing themselves from Reynolds. "The Fraternal Order of Police cannot and will not defend actions that violate our oath to protect and serve," their spokesperson announced. "Officer Reynolds' behavior was criminal, and he will receive no support from this organization." Meanwhile, Ashley was recovering at the local military hospital, where Navy physicians were monitoring her condition. The taser attack had left her with muscle soreness and minor burns, but her biggest concern was the media attention and how it might affect her naval career. Colonel Martinez sat beside Ashley's hospital bed, reviewing incident reports and coordinating with various agencies. "Ashley, you need to understand something," the colonel said gently. "This isn't about you being a problem for the Navy. This is about the Navy supporting one of our finest officers who was the victim of a crime." The hospital had been flooded with flowers, cards, and messages of support from military personnel around the world. Ashley's fellow SEALs had created a video message expressing their outrage and support, which was viewed millions of times and helped shift public opinion even further against Reynolds. But the most significant development came from the Department of Justice in Washington. Attorney General Lisa Chen announced that the federal government would be launching a comprehensive civil rights investigation, not just into Reynolds' actions, but into the entire court security system that had allowed such behavior to continue unchecked. When a decorated military officer can be assaulted in a courthouse simply for existing while black, "We have a fundamental breakdown in our justice system," the Attorney General declared. "This investigation will ensure that such failures never happen again." Reynolds himself sat in a federal detention facility, finally understanding that his actions had consequences he couldn't escape. His attorney, a public defender who had drawn the short straw, was already discussing plea bargain options because the case against Reynolds was absolutely overwhelming. The charges were serious and numerous: federal civil rights violations, assault under color of authority, contempt of court, and several state charges including assault and battery. Legal experts were predicting a sentence of at least 5 to 7 years in federal prison, plus the complete loss of his law enforcement certification and pension. David's case, meanwhile, had been completely dismissed. The prosecutor issued a public apology, acknowledging that David had been targeted by the same discriminatory mindset that led to the attack on his sister. "Mr. Johnson should never have been charged in the first place," the prosecutor admitted. We will be reviewing all cases involving Officer Reynolds to ensure no one else was wrongfully prosecuted. The ripple effects extended far beyond Reynolds himself. Two supervisors who had repeatedly ignored complaints about his behavior were suspended pending investigation. The sheriff announced mandatory bias training for all court security personnel, and new protocols were established for handling complaints against officers. Ashley's story was also inspiring changes in military policy. The Pentagon announced new guidelines for supporting service members who became victims of discrimination or assault while in civilian settings. A special liaison office was created to ensure that military personnel received proper support when dealing with civil rights violations. The media coverage had transformed Ashley into an unlikely spokesperson for police. Reform in military service. Interview requests poured in from major networks. But Ashley was selective about her appearances, choosing to focus on constructive solutions rather than simply rehashing the incident. In her first major television interview, conducted from the hospital, Ashley struck a tone that surprised many viewers. "I don't want Officer Reynolds to just go to prison and disappear," she said thoughtfully. "I want his case to be a wake-up call for every police department in America. How many complaints does someone need before action is taken? How many people have to be hurt before we fix these broken systems?" Her words resonated because they came from someone who clearly understood both the value of good law enforcement and the danger of unchecked power. Ashley had worked with police officers in combat zones overseas, and she knew the difference between professional law enforcement and abuse of authority. The courthouse where the incident occurred had become an unlikely pilgrimage site. People left flowers, American flags, and messages of support on the steps. A local artist created a mural depicting Ashley in her Navy uniform with the words, "Justice for all," underneath. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from law enforcement officers themselves. Police departments around the country began sharing the video in training sessions as an example of everything officers should never do. Professional police organizations used Reynolds' case to demonstrate the importance of proper training, accountability, and respectful treatment of all citizens. Officer Brooks, Reynolds' former partner, had requested a transfer to a different assignment and was cooperating fully with investigators. "I should have spoken up years ago," he admitted to internal affairs investigators. "I knew Rick had problems, but I thought loyalty meant protecting your partner. I realize now that real loyalty means protecting the people we're supposed to serve." His statement became part of new training materials about the difference between loyalty and complicity, helping other officers understand their duty to report misconduct rather than cover it up. The reckoning that had begun with Reynolds' assault on Ashley was spreading through law enforcement culture itself, forcing long overdue conversations about bias, accountability, and the true meaning of protect and serve. 6 months later, the same courthouse that had witnessed Officer Reynolds' shocking assault on Ashley was hosting a very different kind of proceeding. This time, Reynolds sat at the defendant's table, wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of a uniform, facing the consequences of his actions in the very courtroom where he had committed his crimes. Judge Wong, who had witnessed the original incident, had recused herself from Reynolds' criminal trial to avoid any appearance of bias. Federal Judge Robert Kim presided over the sentencing hearing, but the gallery was once again filled with many of the same people who had been there that fateful day. Ashley sat in the front row, wearing her Navy dress uniform once more. But this time she was there not as a character witness for her brother, but as the victim of a federal crime. Her presence was a powerful reminder of the dignity and service that Reynolds had attacked when he deployed his taser 6 months earlier. The evidence against Reynolds had been overwhelming from the beginning. The courtroom video, the cell phone recordings, the testimony of federal agents, and his own radio communications had created an ironclad case. His attorney had negotiated a plea bargain early in the process, knowing that taking the case to trial would only result in a harsher sentence. "Mr. Reynolds," Judge Kim addressed the former officer directly, "you have pleaded guilty to federal civil rights violations, assault under color of authority, and contempt of court. Before I impose sentence, do you have anything to say to this court?" Reynolds stood slowly, his lawyer beside him. The arrogant, angry man who had attacked Ashley was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood the magnitude of what he had done. "Your Honor," he began, his voice barely audible, I know that nothing I say can undo the harm I caused. I let my prejudices and anger control my actions, and I betrayed everything law enforcement is supposed to represent. He turned toward Ashley and her family. Lieutenant Commander Johnson, I am deeply sorry for what I did to you. You were serving your country with honor while I was disgracing my badge. I hope that someday you can forgive me, though I don't deserve it. Ashley listened to his words with the same composure she had shown throughout the ordeal. Her expression was serious but not angry. She had moved beyond hatred to focus on healing and positive change. Judge Kim reviewed the case details before announcing the sentence. Mr. Reynolds, your actions represent one of the most clear-cut cases of civil rights violations this court has ever seen. You assaulted a decorated military officer who was peacefully exercising her constitutional right to attend a public hearing. Your behavior was not just criminal. It was an attack on the very principles our justice system is meant to protect. The sentence was severe, but fair. 7 years in federal prison, 5 years of supervised probation, complete forfeiture of his law enforcement pension, and a lifetime ban from any law enforcement position. Reynolds would also be required to pay restitution to Ashley and perform community service focused on civil rights education. As the judge read the sentence, Ashley felt not satisfaction, but a sense of closure. Justice wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability and ensuring that others wouldn't suffer the same treatment. After the hearing, Ashley held a press conference on the courthouse steps where she had first entered 6 months earlier. The media attention had never completely faded, but today felt different, more hopeful than angry. Today's sentence sends a clear message that no one is above the law, Ashley told the assembled reporters. Officer Reynolds will serve his time, but the real victory is in the changes we've seen throughout law enforcement. His actions were terrible, but they've sparked conversations and reforms that will protect other people from experiencing what I went through. The changes Ashley referenced were substantial and ongoing. The courthouse had implemented new training protocols and oversight procedures. The police department had created an independent civilian review board with real authority to investigate complaints. Most importantly, a culture of accountability was replacing the old system of protecting bad officers. David, whose case had started this entire chain of events, had become an advocate for criminal justice reform. He worked with organizations focused on police accountability and often spoke about how systemic bias affects families like his. My sister's courage turned our worst moment into a catalyst for change. He often said in speeches. The Navy had promoted Ashley to full commander and assigned her to a special position working with congressional committees on military justice reform. Her expertise in both military service and civil rights had made her a valuable voice in policy discussions about accountability and fair treatment. Colonel Martinez, Ashley's commanding officer, attended the sentencing and spoke with reporters afterward. Commander Johnson exemplifies everything we want in a naval officer, she said. She faced injustice with dignity, turned victimization into advocacy, and used her platform to make positive change. The Navy is proud to have her in our ranks. Perhaps the most meaningful change was happening in police departments across the country. Reynolds's case had become a standard part of police academy training, not just as an example of what not to do, but as a discussion starter about bias, accountability, and proper use of force. Many officers credited the case with helping them examine their own attitudes and behaviors. Sheriff Thompson, who had taken responsibility for his department's failures, had implemented sweeping reforms that became a model for other jurisdictions. We failed Lieutenant Commander Johnson and our community by allowing Officer Reynolds's behavior to continue unchecked, he acknowledged. But we've learned from that failure and built systems to prevent it from happening again. Officer Brooks, Reynolds's former partner, had become an instructor in the new training programs, teaching other officers about the importance of speaking up when they witness misconduct. His transformation from silent bystander to active reformer had inspired many other officers to examine their own role in maintaining accountability. As Ashley walked down the courthouse, steps after Reynolds' sentencing, she reflected on how much had changed since that terrible morning 6 months earlier. She had entered this building as a Navy SEAL testifying for her brother and left as a victim of assault. Today she was leaving as an advocate for justice and an example of how dignity in the face of injustice could create positive change. Her Phone buzzed with a text message from a young Navy recruit who had seen her story and decided to enlist. Commander Johnson, your example showed me that serving with honor means standing up for what's right even when it's difficult. Thank you for showing me what real leadership looks like. Ashley smiled as she read the message. This was why she had chosen to speak out rather than simply trying to move on quietly. Reynolds would serve his time and hopefully learn from his mistakes. But the real victory was in inspiring others to choose justice over silence, accountability over protection of bad actors, and hope over hatred. The courthouse steps, once the scene of an unthinkable assault, had become a symbol of how the justice system could work when people of courage demanded better. And Ashley Johnson, the Navy SEAL who had turned victimization into advocacy, would continue serving her country, both in uniform and out, for many years to come. Justice, as she had learned, wasn't just about punishment. It was about creating a better future for everyone.